All right, kids. Sorry I'm a little bit late. I got tied up in the coffee area. You know how that goes. It happens. Got tied up fellowshipping. Sorry about that. All right. Well, it is good to see everyone here today. Thank you so very much for coming our way. And if you're tuning in online, thank you for tuning in. We're glad you're doing that. I forgot to say that when I got up to preach. But we are thrilled when folks tune in and join us there, and hope you'll be able to tune in anytime that you can. Well, we are, of course, in our study that we're calling a challenge, the discipleship challenge. And what we're really trying to do is get us to think deeply about, really, for lack of a better way to describe it, which I think is a good way, is just falling more deeply in love with God and just more passionate about knowing Him and following Him. And so last week, if you were with us last week, we talked about, what all that really matters is the treasure of our relationship with God. And we started off with the Matthew chapter 13, verse 44 verse, which is that one verse parable about the man who found the hidden treasure. And we kind of talked a little bit about the background of events like that. And when this man uncovered this treasure in a field, he sold everything that he had to buy that field, because that treasure was more valuable than anything that he had. And the whole idea there is our relationship with God, to have fellowship with God, to know God, is a treasure that is, the point Jesus is making is it is worth more than anything that we have. It is really all that matters, is that relationship with God. And as we talked about it, then we talked about the parable of the sower, and most of us assume we're good soil when it's something that we probably don't need to assume. We need to really do some hard evaluation. And so as we talked about that, we came to a point to where we said we're going to do a test for lukewarmness. And that's where we stopped last week. And in this book that we're all using, the classes are all using kind of to guide our study, the author has some characteristics, 16 characteristics of lukewarm people. And I said, what we're going to do today, we're going to look at those. We're going to look at them, we're going to think about them, we're going to talk about them a little bit. And the whole point is, of course, is to promote internal, evaluation, introspection, and kind of see where we're standing, to think seriously and think deeply, and hopefully think objectively when it comes to where we're at in our relationship with God. So with that in mind, we're thinking in terms here of, we want to ask the question, are we totally in love with Christ? Are we totally in love with God? And so, the Bible challenges us to test ourselves, and so that's, again, what this is all about. So with that in mind, let's take a look. These are some of the characteristics that he offers of lukewarm people. Here's his first one. Lukewarm people attend church fairly regularly. It is what is expected of them. What they believe, quote, good Christians do, so they go. Lukewarm people attend church fairly regularly. Okay, it doesn't mean if you're a regular a church attender, you're lukewarm. It doesn't mean that, because if you truly love Jesus, you're also a church. But a church attender, you want to be with God's people. You're in love with God. You're in love with His people. But one of the characteristics here is that it's a reminder that you can be a churchgoer and not be transformed. That's what this is a reminder of. You know, as we were talking about this morning in the lesson, I said 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is really, it's about fruit that authentic Christians, truly converted and transformed Christians, are going to bear fruit. There's going to be certain things in their lives that characterize their lives. And so you can, there's some things that if you're lukewarm, they're still there, but that you can do these things and not be truly, deeply transformed. One of those is attend church. One of those is attend church. And that's why he says lukewarm people attend church fairly regularly. So if you're lukewarm, or if you attend church fairly regularly, it doesn't mean you're off the hook yet for being, considering yourself lukewarm. You're not off the hook yet, because lukewarm people do that. It reminds us of what Jesus said in, Isaiah chapter 23, and that is, he says, "These people come near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is made up of only rules taught by men." Jesus is actually going to quote that when he's here in Matthew chapter 15, I believe it is. "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." And if we spent time, we could go spend time in the Old Testament, and we could see occasions, Isaiah chapter 1, we could see it in Amos, where they're going through the sacrifices, they're going to the temple, they're going through all of the things that they go through, and God says, I'm not interested in your sacrifices. And the reason is that they're not transformed. We would say they're going to church. And so that's the first thing that he points out. Lukewarm people attend church fairly regularly. Okay, number 2. I said there's 16 characteristics here. Lukewarm people give money to the church. So you say, well, I attend church regularly, I give. Yeah. That doesn't necessarily mean you're not lukewarm, because lukewarm people give money to charity, they give money to church, as long as it doesn't impinge on their standard of living. They give money, but not to the point to where it changes their standard of living. He says if they have a little extra and it's easy to give and safe to give, they do it. After all, he says, God loves a cheerful giver. Now compare that to something that David said. Turn over to 1 Chronicles. So we're going to compare these things to some things that God said. Look at 1 Chronicles. Get to chapter 21. Chapter 21. And this is a very familiar statement. It's a great statement that David makes. Somebody read verse 24 if you don't mind. Somebody read 1 Chronicles 21:24.
Then King David said to the Lord, "No, but I will surely buy it for the full price, for I will not take what is yours to the Lord, nor offer that
I will not offer something to God that costs me nothing." That is a challenging statement. I will not offer something that costs me nothing. Is it possible to be a big giver and it doesn't cost you anything? Is that possible? I see a few heads going like this.
Well, if you're talking about something besides money, it's possible.
Okay, let's keep it with money though. Is it possible to be a big monetary giver, but actually it's not costing you anything? Yes. Do what? Yeah. Okay. Selma brought up Luke 21. Turn over there. She says she sees it like this. And I think she sees it absolutely right. Look at Luke 21. So Jesus is standing nearby. There was this particular area where contributions were made, monetary contributions were made. And they had these little receptacles that people would give their money in. And Jesus is standing there with his disciples and is watching all of this unfold. And it says, and he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw a poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. Almost worth nothing. And he said, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all out of their surplus put into the offering. But she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on. That is one of the most potent, that is one of the hardest blows, I think, that Jesus delivers to people. I think this shows that, yeah, you can be a big giver, and it really doesn't cost anything. You haven't really given up anything. It can be possible to be that. And so that's why he says the second characteristic is that lukewarm people, they can give, they can actually be big givers and give. But that doesn't necessarily mean being a big giver doesn't mean that that you're absolutely passionately in love with Jesus Christ. Don.
Another way of looking at it is without the money issue. There was a man many years ago that when I first saw him doing things in the church, I thought he really doesn't have enough talent to be doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Until I found out that he who had less talents than me was doing far more for the Lord than I was.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, let me say something about that. Don said, and we'll kind of get to some of these things, but Charlie kind of mentioned this too when he said, if you're talking about money, there's a lot of things that we think about giving, and usually what you'll find is oftentimes what you'll find among lukewarm is that it's easier to give money than time and energy and expending yourself in those kinds of ways. But you're exactly right about, sometimes you look at someone and think that you might not think they have the certain talent to be doing something, and yet they are, you have to guard yourself against that thing, because then you realize how much they're doing, which reflects that heart. But it's not really hard to give money. Sometimes some people think it's the hardest thing to do. Well, if you have it, it's not really hard to give it. Ron.
Years ago, there was a little record or a tape that we could use to knock on doors of people who were not members of the church.
Yeah.
And it was, I think it was entitled "A Few Minutes with Somebody You Love."
Yeah.
And I don't think it took but 3 minutes.
Yeah.
But we used to meet once a week, and everybody talk about their contacts. And there was a little, I said, a gentleman who was tongue-tied.
Uh-huh.
And he was not married, he was not a rich, wealthy guy, but he said, you know, I believe I can talk to people about Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1 month, he'd set up 17 Bible studies.
That's amazing.
And we asked him to stop because we didn't have enough people. So sometimes we
Yeah,
judge,
that's right.
and the Lord is the only one.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. As Ron was telling about somebody he knew that, didn't have the gifts that some people had in terms of his abilities, and yet his passion for the lost led him to just set up Bible study after Bible study after Bible study. But let's keep taking a look at some of the characteristics of lukewarm people. Lukewarm people, he says, and again, challenging us to think on these things, lukewarm people tend to choose what is popular over what is right when they are in conflict. They desire to fit in both at church and outside of church. They care more about what people think of their actions, like what we just mentioned, church attendance and giving. They care more about what people think of their actions than what God thinks of their hearts and lives. Well, that reminds us of a couple of passages. Turn over to Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6 and verse 26. Jesus says, "Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for their fathers used to treat the false prophets in the same way. Woe to you when men speak well, when all men speak well of you." You can't have it both ways. Lukewarm, they want to be, as he just said here, when there's in a conflict here between what is right and what is popular, what is culturally popular, they will often they will actually go with, more often than not, what is popular, and so Jesus says, listen, if there's a problem. There is a problem with you if everybody likes you, if everybody speaks well of you, if the world speaks well of you. In Revelation chapter 3 and verse 1, we read the statement, "I know your deeds. You have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead." You can have a reputation. Or Matthew chapter 23, verse 5 through 7. Look at Matthew chapter 23. Reminds us of this, Matthew chapter 23. This is where Jesus is exposing the Pharisees. And he says in verse 5, "But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at the banquets and the chief seats in the synagogue, respectful greetings in the marketplace, and being called rabbi." This is what they like. This is what they covet most of all. And so when they're faced with a conflict between what is right and what is popular, lukewarm people will gravitate toward the popular. They'll gravitate toward the popular. Number 4. Let's look at number 4. Here it is. Lukewarm people don't really want people to be saved from their sin. They want only to be saved from the penalty of their sin. They don't, and when you kind of think of this at first that doesn't sound right, but when you think of it, you'll see what he means. They don't genuinely hate sin. And they aren't genuinely sorry for it. They're merely sorry because God is going to punish them. Lukewarm people don't really believe that this new life Jesus offers is better than the old sinful one. That's an interesting statement, I think. They don't really want to be, they don't hate sin. I don't want to be delivered from sin. I just want to be delivered from the penalty of it. There's this, I'm sorry that God's going to punish me for it. There's this aspect in them that still the life they love the most is a life of moral rebellion, the things that they love the most. Now listen, I'm not saying, now it's true no matter how long you've been a Christian, we're walking around in unredeemed bodies. And there are impulses and there are desires that go against the character of God and the will of God. I know that. And so at some level, we're all, have this, at one level, on the fleshly level, we're drawn to sin. But this is talking about on the deepest emotional level. This is where you see Paul in Romans chapter 7, where he expresses his own personal frustrations at his own struggles. Oh, wretched man that I am. He acknowledges his fight with sin and his failure sometimes with sin. And he hates himself for it. He doesn't want to be a sinner. And he legitimately hates sin. And he legitimately is sorry for it. Now, when we're really in love with Christ, we're going to get to this point. We're not just sorry that we have to pay a penalty for sin, but in the deepest part of our being and heart, we hate sin. We don't want to be a sinner, even though we are. And Paul's talking to the church at Rome, and there at the end of chapter 5, he knows what some of them are going to ask when he talks about how the grace of God is so abundant that wherever sin is, grace abounds even more. And he anticipates what some of them are going to say. Well, if the bigger the sin, the more grace, should we sin some more so that we can get more grace? And so Paul sets that up there in Romans chapter 6. Should we continue in sin that grace may increase? And the answer is no. May it absolutely never be that way. How can we who've died to sin, he says, still live in it? So if you're falling in love with Jesus, as closer you get to Jesus and the more deeply in love with Jesus you get, you don't just hate the thought of paying the penalty of sin. You hate the thought of being a sinner. You hate the thought of being a sinner. Even though you are, and even though you find aspects of it desirable, you still hate that you're a sinner, and you long for ultimate release from that. Any questions, comments, observations about that, or anything, or any other one that we've looked at? See, I thought this was a tough one. Harry, please.
Some people, when they envision heaven, see a place where all of their lustful or prideful or covetous desires can be fulfilled.
That's exactly right. Well, here's what I think about that. Harry said, some people, when they kind of envision heaven, they kind of envision a place where all of your impulses, your baser impulses, your fleshly impulses can be fulfilled. Most people actually who kind of envision an eternity of that, they don't think about it in terms of heaven, because they've been taught, people in the past have had enough awareness and consciousness of Bible that that what they envision heaven as is kind of a place where fun is stifled. Those things aren't there. And what they tend to do is see hell as a place that what hell is going to be is a nonstop party. And what hell is going to be is just what Harry said there, that it's a place of you can indulge all of your impulses. And so you'll hear people talk about, I'd rather have that. And of course, those are the lies of Satan, because that's not what hell isn't a nonstop party. It's not the indulgence. But and they'll speak of hell is in reality a sense of heaven because all the impulses. Now, what truly heaven is as God's redeemed people, those who are in love with Him, is fighting against sin. There will no longer be any battles against it. And the impulses of the flesh, we will be glorified. We'll be made perfect physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And so the battles will be over then. But yeah, I think some people, that's exactly right. That they, in their minds, they want an eternity where you got you got all the impulses fulfilled. But I felt myself, as I was reading through these 16 characteristics that he presents as lukewarm to think about, I found this one to be a tough one. Where am I at in terms of hatred of sin, hatred of being a sinner? Do I want to be delivered from sin or just the penalty of sin? And you're just frustrated because sometimes you just struggle with your own brokenness and sinfulness. But I think he's absolutely right that the more deeply in love with Christ we become, the more we want to be delivered not just from the penalty of sin, but from sin. Anything else?
I think sometimes we have it's not like a clear cut of things. We hate some things.
Mm-hmm.
We have like a favorite sins that we consider a part of those.
Yeah, I think you're right. That sometimes, that we don't have this clear cut, as you would say, hatred of sin. So there might be some sins that we do have a clear cut hatred for. Don't want it, and then there's others that not so much. Yeah, and it's the constant challenge that we face, and that's what growing in love with Christ is all about. Trying to move closer and closer toward the hatred of all sin, the sin that is a part of who we are and a part of the world in which we live in. As we grow in love with Christ, we ought to be growing in our desire to be free from sin, not just the penalty of sin. Yeah. Number 5, let's look at it. Lukewarm people are moved by stories about people who do radical things for Christ, yet they don't act. They like to hear about these radical things for Christ. Hey, Scotty, would you mind? There's a couple of ladies out there. Oh, Matt's out there. I didn't know if Matt was out there. So they like to hear the stories about, they're moved by the stories, but they don't act. They assume that such action is for extreme Christians. And sometimes they will use words like extreme. Sometimes they'll use words like radical. These are radical Christians. But what he points out, and I think this is true, lukewarm people call radical what Jesus expected of all of his followers. Lukewarm people think, they see a form of Christianity that they would call, well, that's just radical. But what they call radical is really just what ordinary Christianity ought to be like. You know, James chapter 1 and verse 2, do not merely listen to the words and so to deceive yourself. Do what it says. Be doers of the word, not just hearers only. Matthew chapter 21, here's a passage as we think about that is familiar. Matthew chapter 21, verse 28. What do you think? A man has 2 sons, and he came to the first and says, son, go to work today in a vineyard. And he answered, I will not. But afterwards he regretted it and went. The man came to the second son and said the same thing. And he answered, I will. But he didn't go. Which of the 2, Jesus said, did the will of his father? They said the first. And Jesus said to them, truly I say to you that the tax collector and the prostitutes will get into the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you didn't believe him, but the tax collectors and prostitutes did believe him, and you seeing this did not even feel remorse afterwards so as to believe him. So he's talking to the religionists of his day, the ones that say, they are on fire for God, and they did nothing. Lukewarm people are much like that. They're moved by the stories, but they don't act. They're not going to act on that. Number 6, real quickly, lukewarm people share their faith. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot a key word, rarely. Lukewarm people rarely share their faith with their neighbors, coworkers, or friends. They don't want to be rejected. They don't want to make people uncomfortable by talking about private issues like religion. Lukewarm people rarely share their faith. Or even bring up faith. Faith matters. I think we can put in this, invite their neighbors to worship. Invite their neighbors to Bible study. Of course, it reminds us of Jesus saying, whoever acknowledges me before men, I will acknowledge him before my Father in heaven, but he who does not. He says, I'll disown before my Father in heaven. They rarely share their faith. They're uncomfortable about it. They don't want to be rejected. They just don't. Number 7, lukewarm people gauge their morality or their goodness by comparing themselves to the secular world. They feel satisfied when they aren't as horrible as the guy down the street. They gauge their morality by what they see, comparing themselves to the secular world. And, I'm not as bad as him. I must be morally excellent. That's a lukewarm approach. Of course, that's not, and a passage that reminds us of that is Luke 18, the parable there of the Pharisee and the tax collector who went up to the temple. The Pharisee stood and prayed to him and said, God, I thank you I'm not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers. See, I'm not like them. I'm different. Or even like this tax collector, I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all that I get. I'm not like them. And so that's how they measure their goodness. Whereas what is the standard for those who are in love with Christ measuring? What's their standard of goodness that God calls us to measure ourselves by? Do what? Him? Yeah, Jesus. And His Word. That's the standard. And so not making comparisons. Don?
I think that's the key thing, who we compare ourselves to.
That's exactly right.
10 years ago, I was listening to a sermon and thinking, boy, he's really giving it to them. And then I realized I was thinking of people who did less than me. And then I started thinking of people that do more than me. I didn't like that sermon at all.
That is so true, Don. If you didn't hear him, it's he years ago he was listening to a sermon and he thought, man, he's really giving it to him. And then it just kind of thought, whoa, wait a minute. He was thinking about those who did less than him. Then he started thinking about those people who do more than him, and suddenly he didn't like that sermon because he's now the one that the people who do more than him are probably thinking of him, you. That's lukewarm people tend to compare themselves. They measure their morality to not only, it says the secular world, he says, but not only just secular world, I think even in the church. And if we're kind of in the scope of the church, our morality we feel pretty good about it compared to the other brethren. But no, that's what lukewarm people do. That's not what people who are absolutely in love with Jesus do. They want to reflect the character of Christ in their life, the character and the will of Christ. Number 8, got to move pretty quick now. Lukewarm people say they love Jesus, and he is indeed a part of their lives, but only a part. They give him a section of their time, a little of their money, and their thoughts, but he isn't allowed to control their lives. Whoa. Lukewarm people say they love Jesus, and he really is a part of their lives. And they give him some of their time, they give him some of their money, and they give him some of their thoughts. But they don't want Jesus to control them. Well, that's one to think about right there. Bob?
I think maybe a lot of lukewarm people in Matthew 23 talking about the 7 woes.
Mm-hmm.
I think they could fit into just about either one of those.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I think I absolutely believe all those 7 woes, Bob said, that you see in Matthew chapter 23 could fit in all of these that we're looking at, all of these categories of lukewarmness. I think you're exactly right. Yep. Number 9, lukewarm people. Oh, listen to this. Lukewarm people love God, but they don't love him with all their heart, soul, and strength. They would be quick to assure you, he says, that they try to love God that much, but that sort of total devotion isn't really possible for the average person. That kind of devotion, that only has to be for missionaries and radicals and elders and preachers. That's not for the average person. It is for, when Jesus said in Matthew chapter 22, verse 37 and 38, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. This is the first and greatest commandment. That's to everyone. That's to everyone. Number 10, lukewarm people love others, but do not seek to love others as much as they love themselves. Their love of others is typically focused on those who love them in return, like family, friends, and other people that they know and connect with. There's little love left over for those who cannot love them back, much less for those who intentionally slight them, whose kids are better athletes than theirs, or with whom conversations are always awkward or uncomfortable. Their love, in other words, is always highly conditional, very selective, and generally comes with strings attached. Jesus dealt with that in Mark chapter 5 when he said, you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And he said, but I tell you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you'll love only those who love you, what reward will you get? So God calls us to love. That's supernatural love he's calling us to do. The type of love that he's talking about, he said, do not even the pagans do that. This is the type of love that pagans, they love their neighbors, but they don't love them as much as they love themselves. Number 11, real quickly, lukewarm people will serve God and others. They will serve God and others, but there are limits to how far they will go or how much time, money, and energy they're willing to give. They will serve others, and they will serve God. There's just limits to it. There are limits to it. And, and it goes back to Luke 18 that the young man who, all these commandments I've kept, all of them I've kept, he told Jesus. And he said, oh, there's one thing you're lacking. Go sell everything you have and give it to the poor. He was willing to do anything, but he had his limits. And, it behooves us to even think deeply. And it's hard. Man, it's hard to wonder. Sometimes you wonder, do I have limits on my service? God wants us to, lukewarm people have limits. Do we have limits? Number 12, lukewarm people think about life on earth much more often than eternity in heaven. Daily life, he says, is mostly focused on today's to-do list. This week's schedule, next month's vacation. Rarely, if ever, do they intently consider the life to come. Lukewarm people don't ponder very often life to come. I mean, they want to go to heaven. They just don't think about it much. They're so focused, they think about this life so much that they don't think much about life to come. Real quickly, we've got 1 minute left, so let me whip through these last few. Lukewarm people are thankful for their luxuries and comforts. Yes, that's good to be. We all are. Lukewarm people. And rarely consider trying to give as much as possible to the poor. Jesus never said money is the root of all evil, only that the love of money is, they say. It's true. Untold numbers of lukewarm people feel, quote unquote, called to minister to the rich, but very few feel called to minister to the poor. They are thankful for all their blessings, in other words, but they just don't think deeply about trying to give as much as possible away for the kingdom business or the poor in this particular instance. Number 14, lukewarm people do whatever is necessary to keep themselves from feeling too guilty. They want to do the bare minimum to be good enough without it requiring too much of them. They don't like to feel guilty. And they ask, how far can I go before it's considered a sin? Instead of asking, how can I keep myself pure as a temple of the Holy Spirit? They ask, how much do I have to give? Instead of how much can I give? They ask, how much time should I spend praying and reading my Bible? Instead of saying, I wish I didn't have to go to work today so that I could sit here and read longer. Okay, real quickly, two more, last two. Lukewarm people are continually concerned with playing it safe. They are slaves to the God of control. They focus on safe living, and that focus keeps them from sacrificing and risking for God. To that, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but can't kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell. Safe living. And finally, number 16. Lukewarm people feel secure because they attend church. They make a profession of faith. Were baptized, come from a Christian family, live in America, vote Republican. Just as the prophets in the Old Testament warned Israel that they were not safe just because they lived in the land of Israel, so we're not safe just because we wear the label Christian or because some persist in calling us a Christian nation. And we're reminded, of course, Matthew chapter 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father which is in heaven. You know what I think I'm going to do? I think that I am going to, just for the benefit of everyone, since we're all studying this together, I think I might promote further thought by putting these in the bulletin again, listening to them. And people will have them there. Because you may not have the book, this book that we're all using, but you can see, and you can put them somewhere. There'll be constant reminders to evaluate This is a challenge to us. Yes, Ron, last comment.
One major one that's left out.
Yes.
Other mediocre or lukewarm people discourage the original lukewarm. And I have the perfect example.
Okay.
A good friend of mine made up his mind to literally sell everything he had
Yep.
and move to Brazil.
Okay.
And they lived there for 7 years. And he asked me to take him down to something about machinist. They'll get a little piece of steel and it costs $200.
Yeah.
Because they have to have exact.
Okay.
All the way down there, I said, Richard, please don't sell these tubes. You know, it's like burning that
Yeah.
last bridge. He said, Brother Ron, you don't understand. I have to sell these tubes.
Yeah.
I had felt so bad about that. I probably calls him every 2 years and say, I apologize. For the 13th time, he said, don't call me anymore.
Yeah. That's a great point. Ron talked about his own experience, how he felt like he was discouraging someone who chose literally he chose to sell all he had and go to Brazil and work. And so thank you, Ron, for that. It's just thought-provoking. Thank you very much. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for all your comments. And Lord willing, I'll see you tonight.